Good evening and welcome to Hurricanes Before and After the Storm. I'm Linda Rice, Vice President for Grant Making at the Hampton Roads Community Foundation. On behalf of Dr. Deborah DeCroce, President and CEO, and the Board of Directors of the Hampton Roads Community Foundation, I thank you for joining us this evening. As June 1st, the official start of the hurricane season approaches, the Foundation presents tonight several distinguished speakers who will share their knowledge of hurricane preparedness, the importance of preparing for a recovery under blue skies, and Old Dominion University's approach to help our region's most vulnerable recover after a hurricane event. We are pleased to have as our partner for this forum, Old Dominion University's Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience, better known as ICAR. Please join the conversation about this most important topic at the hashtag Hampton Roads Hurricanes throughout the event on Facebook. This event is part of the Understanding Hampton Roads series, the Foundation's effort to advance civic engagement through forums on key topics to help build understanding, to inspire action, and to bring people together to help improve life in our region. I want to thank the Foundation's Board of Directors and government officials who have joined us. Tonight, our speaker is Dr. Carlos Martin, Senior Fellow in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. Also joining us are Dr. Jessica Whitehead, the newly appointed Joan P. Brock Executive Director of the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience at Old Dominion University, who will act as the evening's discussion moderator, and Dr. Joshua Baer, who will share ODU's work to reduce displacement after a hurricane. We are pleased that Dr. Whitehead could join us as she transitions to Hampton Roads and to Old Dominion University to lead the Institute. Our speaker, Dr. Carlos Martin, is an expert on housing and reducing the impact of disasters on homes. He will discuss hurricane preparation, response, and recovery. A prolific author on this topic, Dr. Martin holds a degree in architecture from MIT and his advanced degrees in civil and environmental engineering from Stanford University. Dr. Whitehead is a scientist, meteorologist, and an expert on helping communities bounce back after experiencing severe storms and flooding. As the former resilience officer for North Carolina, she has recent experience assisting communities with hurricane recovery. Dr. Baer is an associate research professor in the Virginia Modeling, Analysis, and Simulation Center and is a program manager at the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience. He hails from New Orleans and experienced firsthand the recovery from Hurricane Katrina. The order for tonight's forum is a presentation by Dr. Martin, followed by a conversation between Dr. Martin and Dr. Baer that will be moderated by Dr. Whitehead. Thank you for the questions you submitted during registration. Our speakers will answer as many as possible. Let's get started, and don't forget to use the hashtag Hampton Roads Hurricanes. Dr. Martin, thank you for being with us tonight from the West Coast. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Lyndon. I should note that I'm usually on the East Coast, very near you all, and I have a sister-in-law that lives in Norfolk. So it's a great pleasure to address everybody who's listening, as well as do it through such fine organizations as the Hampton Roads Community Foundation and ICAR at Old Dominion. I think organizations that are looking to inform people in ways to better their lives are always something I want to support. So thank you for inviting me. And I'm happy to talk about this usually not so happy topic of disasters and disaster recovery and how the listeners can prepare and think about the longer term exposures that they have in their lives and in their properties and for their families. So on that note, I will share some few thoughts primarily around the ideas of how things happen at the policy level, particularly from the federal all the way down to the state and local. So What you see in front of you is a very famous picture post Hurricane Sandy in the New Jersey shore of obviously post storm surge that just came up and took over a roller coaster. I think this is the images, these kinds of images that we see quite often are very scary, and they portend some doom and gloom that's going to affect us all in the future. But it's also an opportunity to think. You all, especially who are joining this call, are most likely the kinds of people who want to know what they can do and want to think about how they can prepare and reduce their exposures. So I'm hoping that our conversation does a little bit of that for you. So one of the things we always have to remember is that in the United States, environmental policy, social policy, economic policy often revolve around crises. And a disaster has to happen for us to then invest the resources and time in a community. And that's in many ways very unfortunate, because then we overemphasize the relief and response, for example, after a hurricane, and then potentially the long-term recovery, and not so much the mitigation. And by that, we mean the things, the infrastructure, the individual housing retrofits, the economic tools like insurance, hazard insurance, as well as other incentives that can help reduce the exposure of individual households. So we're very crisis focused, but what that crisis means is that that's a moment for catalyst, for change. So the first of these crises that really changed my perspective of what I should be doing as a researcher was Hurricane Katrina. I think most people in this country know that as probably the milestone among many. I mean, we've all gone through different experiences ourselves, but this was a national trauma, I think, that we all experienced, and also a sense of failure about what happened, but also what could have been done beforehand. But I'm also very conscious of the fact that Hurricane Katrina is one example that we should all use and learn from, but this is happening everywhere we go. This picture is from Sanford, Virginia, taken after a storm in 2012, October of 2012, that some of you may remember. So these are occurrences that are happening for a variety of reasons, including hurricanes, including just major nor'easters, major precipitation events, and as well as climate change induced sea level rise. So I want to talk about this range of hazards that you all will be experiencing, particularly in the Hampton Roads area, and talk about what you can do to help mitigate those. Speaking of some of the hazards, let's go take an even step further back beyond when the water is rising to why things are rising and what you all will experience. Just the last year, looking at an over 126-year period, right, going back to 1895, the last year, Virginia experienced an above average statewide temperature. So, and that has been occurring for the past several decades. So you're going to see continued heat waves that induce different kinds of storms, that induce all kinds of other kinds of health effects in your local communities. But the one that's probably where is most relevant for you all, and since we're talking about hurricanes, is precipitation. The last year, Virginia was one of a handful of states in the country whose annual precipitation ranked at the much above average level for the past over a century. So these are pretty glaring maps that you're seeing. There's some more. When you delve into just the Hampton Roads area, we start seeing how specific properties are either have gone through past flooding or are exposed to flooding in the future. So this is something that's happening now. For example, we know that 168,188 properties in Virginia, an entire state of Virginia, have been flooded at some point, have experienced some kind of flood damage. When we look at specific events like a hurricane, the numbers are pretty daunting. Hurricane Isabel in 2003, which many of you remember, over 103,600 homes, properties were affected in some way, either by direct flooding, by wind damage, etc. Hurricane Irene in 2011, 48,569 properties were affected. In Hurricane Florence in 2018, 2,384. So we have huge events like Isabel, but these events tend to be happening every year. And as you saw, the hurricane season, which officially starts June 1st, has actually started ahead of time. And we already have a named storm in the Atlantic. So we talked a little about these potential causes. Some of these are hurricanes, like the storms that we talked about. Then there's sea level rise. So knowing that about 168,000 homes have been flooded in Virginia in the past, we know now that the risk of properties in Virginia is at 470,800 properties that are currently at risk right now of flooding, not because I'm in a storm, but because of the likelihood of a storm or an ongoing sea level rise or any other kind of hurricane. By 2050, that number is going to go up to 599,460 properties. So over 500,000 properties in the state of Virginia will be at risk of flooding by 2050. So the maps that you're seeing right here is courtesy of Climate Central. And I want to make sure that Flood First Street Foundation and its flood risk rating. I will be happy to put those links in the documents that you'll be provided. So you can go ahead and look these up yourself. The flood risk factor from First Street Foundation is a very handy tool that you can get down to your individual area. Another source of scientific information is Climate Central, which did a study on affordable assisted housing units and how many of those will be lost by 2050. As you can see, this ranges fairly significantly from about 60 units in Newport News, 8 units in Virginia Beach, but all the way up to 97 units in Hampton, 710 units in Norfolk. That shouldn't surprise a lot of you, knowing the experiences that you're having in terms of flooding. So their affordable housing is at risk, as well as just the broader sense of housing. So where these people will go to and what kind of housing they can occupy during these events and immediately after is a question that you're going to have to grapple with in the longer term, in the midst of already having other housing affordability crises. So we talked about this catalyst, all of this policy and intention occurs when the event strikes, when a hurricane hits. But that's also when money starts pouring in, and you have wide sources of federal dollars, of charitable dollars, of donors giving money, of faith-based organizations stepping in. So it's an interesting point in time to use that level of investment and resources to better your community for the longer term. One slide I always like to show is one that I did for a study called Insult to Injury, where we looked at the financial consequences to people at all ranges of income and debt and assets from any specific hazard event. And this shows you just from the federal perspective of what kinds of programs exist. And this is for individual families, individual households. So you know FEMA's assistance, which in some, hopefully there are some people on this call who have gone through that kind of experience of trying to access these resources, but it's short-lived. FEMA is meant to be a relief and response and very short-term recovery organization. So at most, you'll see the third bar down, the FEMA individual assistance will go out to 18 months. And that's assistance for temporary housing, immediate needs. For example, it's being used for the pandemic response, for funeral costs, et cetera. So there's a range of uses that it has, but it's only within a very short time frame. And the application period is only for about 60 days after the event happens. So for people who have extenuating circumstances, there are appeals, but it's a much shorter time frame. The longer term recovery funds, if they are appropriated, don't kick in from HUD, from the HUD's Community Development Block Grant for Disaster Recovery, up until well past the 18-month mark. Typically, we did a study on the rate timing of CDBG-DR, and those really don't start becoming available for up to 2 years after the fact. And that's when you just start getting money. So there's that literal valley of death that occurs after you may have temporary assistance from FEMA to recover to long-term recovery. And again, the long-term recovery funds are not set in stone. They're not a FEMA statutorily authorized program. They may be appropriated by Congress if your congressional delegation is able to push it. Otherwise, it ends with the FEMA assistance. So where else does money come from? I quite enjoy showing this slide because you see the spaghetti that it takes for an individual jurisdiction to be able to access funding from a wide variety of federal, state, and city and county sources. This is from the Houston Chronicle, which was a depiction of how the post-Harvey recovery funding was going. And it's exactly as you see it. It means jurisdictions and individual households have to often manage all of this process on their own. So when it's very local, what does that mean? This also means that a lot of your money to do the long-term planning, which isn't getting funded by federal assistance, is landing on your state and local governments, state, county, and municipal governments. In some cases, special districts like water districts and stormwater districts. So as you see for fixed assets, so this is the kind of infrastructure conversation we've been having. I know that there's a national conversation going on about infrastructure right now. And part of the reason that's happening is because the state and local governments are almost paying the whole thing. They have for the past half century. So the federal government contribution to much of that has severely diminished. So much burden occurs on the states and local governments when they are also the ones that are in the midst of suffering through disaster. When you look by sector of how much investment is going proportionally between federal and local government, I want you to look at the first bar there, the public safety bar, because that's where infrastructure investments like flood defensive infrastructure would be happening. And you could barely see the little blue bar of the federal contribution to that pot. So this is a huge concern. There certainly is an interest among every state government, regardless of political party or persuasion, to make sure that the federal government is contributing to the well-being of local communities. And you can see why. So we talked about cash. So what does cash also mean? Cash also brings about this idea of command. And when I say command, I mean ambition. It means resourcefulness. It means ability to attract and leverage champions and other individuals that can help harness that money and tailor it to something that's going to benefit everybody for the longer term, not just for the very short recovery term, which is often sort of, it seems like it's the most imperative, but it may not be the most effective use of money or the most helpful for social equity issues. So there's a lot of pictures I'm showing you here, and I'm going to go through them quickly. So these are examples of how that kind of resources, that kind of ambition can be leveraged. The first two are a picture of what's called the Big U, which was a project funded by HUD under the Rebuild by Design competition, looking at developing a series of seawalls, wetland areas around southern Manhattan to protect a wide swath, not just of Wall Street, but also of public housing, of lower income communities in the Lower East Side. That second slide are those community engagement processes with the Lower East Side, attempting to see how can community input on these kinds of design infrastructure. That requires, though, that there has to be elected officials that are willing to step up to the table and say, we need to talk, we need to have this conversation. And I'm giving you examples that are completely bipartisan. The first is from Satellite Beach, that's the city manager, Courtney Barker, who was very adamant about saying we have to step up to the issue of our constantly flooding roads and shoreline, or else we're not going to have a community to exist in. The second is Don Zimmer from Hoboken, former mayor of Hoboken, who was a leader of some of the similar kinds of projects from Rebuild by Design. On the bottom, I want to have you think a little bit creatively about other kinds of resources that your communities and your governments should be employing. The first was an actual local nonprofit community-based organization, the Southwest Workers Union in San Antonio, Texas, that came up with its climate resilience plan before the city of San Antonio did. In fact, it became a model for the city of San Antonio, and the city of San Antonio adopted many of the recommendations that this community created on its own. The second is the Gentilly District, which is another funded project from HUD, this time for the National Disaster Resilience Competition that folks in Virginia may be familiar with. And this was a layered, really interesting design approach. So you have to bring in the designers that are leaders in the community to think about not only household specific infrastructure that can be done like retrofits and home elevations and buyouts, but also and that on the other extreme, the big seawalls, the sea gates, all of those major big infrastructure projects, to think about these opportunities like bioswales and water gardens within communities that can help temper some of the effects of a big storm, as well as provide value for the local communities. Miami, of course, is very well known for its hurricane exposure, and they created a general obligation bond several years ago, passed because the whole city of Miami was done with getting flooded on a regular basis. So it's a regular general obligation bond like any other city or jurisdiction, county or state can put together. But the revenue from the bond proceeds are going to specifically in resilience and climate adaptation processes. Of course, last I want to talk about Norfolk, the Coastal Adaptation Community Transformation Plan that has been under the works, as well as the wide range of plans that are happening, not just in the state of Virginia. So on the top are primarily Virginia level plans for adaptation, coastal change, hurricane planning. But on the bottom are all specific jurisdictions. You all are seeing what is ahead of you and you're starting to prepare. So from Virginia Beach through Norfolk, Hampton Roads, there are many plans that I would encourage you all, if you're not already being involved with or haven't read, to become involved in those engagement processes. These should all have a public engagement component, and your voice needs to be heard in these. So now that we have command means cognition, understanding what is going on and what, both in terms of individual risk, but also your vulnerability. What is it that you have to do to prepare for that hazard and what the hazard could do to your property and your family? So for quite some time, I've been looking at this differential between what is exposure, which is like what the hazard can do to you, versus your vulnerability. That your income, your geography, the location of your home, the quality of your home, and other demographic characteristics, your physical abilities, if you have a physical disability, your age, your gender, and your race play into your ability to prepare for and have the bandwidth to even be able to conceive what may be happening in the future, so you avoid slipping through the cracks, as you can see in this chart. So one study I'm going to talk about is one that we're doing in the New Orleans area called the Housing Resilience Project, where we did a major survey of the 7 parish area in Greater New Orleans and asking them a series of questions. I'm going to focus just on some pieces about what the specific things individuals have done or could do. So one important thing to distinguish are things that are preparedness related versus mitigation related. And these are things that you can do in Virginia, in the Hampton Roads area now. On the preparedness side, there are things like having an emergency generator, having 3-day supply of emergency food and water, having your documents in a central place, your important documents like your mortgage, the title, your bank documents, your birth certificates, and those sorts of things in a file that you can easily move if you have to evacuate. And well, of course, having an evacuation plan. Like all of these are important things. And what we see in our studies is obviously that's the yellow lines. More people do more of these than mitigation. On mitigation, we're talking about a range of home elevation, roof repair, and I'll show you a slide that shows you a bunch of these other things. But they're the things that you would actually do to your property to make changes separate from just getting ready for the event itself. So way more people are doing preparedness. I encourage you to continue doing those, but you should also look at the mitigation things that can help protect your person and your property for the longer term. So here's an idea about mitigation activities, and I'll go through them quickly because the thing I want to talk about most in this slide is how things vary by age and by race, just in the taking up of these mitigation activities. So I mentioned, if you see in the middle, mitigation since purchase, strengthening people's homes, roof, is always the highest. People tend to be able to do that and want to do that on a higher rate than anything else. Moving equipment, for example, from a basement or a first floor up to the attic. So heating equipment, ventilation, electrical equipment, so it doesn't get flooded and destroyed permanently, installing storm shutters, etc. And these slides will be available afterwards, so you can go back and look at some of these other things that may be applicable in your area. But what's interesting here is that we found that non-white communities, non-white households, excuse me, tend to be much higher on the pickup in many of these mitigation efforts than their white counterparts. There were some correlations with political ideology, but not holding for income. It was a very interesting finding for us. And also you'll notice that there's a pattern by age of who does what kind of thing when. So for example, the things that are more expensive, like a home elevation, are going to be done by people who are more established, elderly, people who may have more equity in their homes, who may have more wealth established, to be able to do the more expensive things. In Louisiana post-Katrina, there are a wide number of programs and financial incentives from public coffers, from the state government, from county, and from city governments to inspire people to do some of these mitigation activities that I just talked about. These are things that exist rarely outside of places like Louisiana. So in Virginia, you may see, look out for whether these exist, but I would encourage you to not look too far. I mean, look as far as you can, but you're not going to find too many in Virginia. And certainly our friends at ICAR will be able to talk about this much more for you. But things that they did have were things like sales tax holidays to purchase, for example, a backup generator, pumps, and that sort of thing. They had a sales tax holiday for those purchases. Getting insurance premium discounts. So this is not a state level deal. It's one from the federal government, from National Flood Insurance Program, or from your retail insurer. That if you do certain activities, for example, build up to a fortified home standard that we'll talk about later in the session, you can get a premium on your premium discount on your insurance. Then other things like doing your voluntary retrofit and getting the tax deduction from the state. Things like getting, if you install certain technologies, you get a rebate. So there are things that other states could be doing, and I know that many states, including Virginia, to be honest, are exploring. So another thing that we are always concerned about in our studies is how much people actually know. What are they told, and where were they informed by things? So we asked several questions about what people were told. So it shouldn't surprise you that people in flood zones, and unfortunately outside of flood zones, were told about the location of their home in a flood zone. So surprisingly, people who knew that they were in a flood zone still chose to live in that flood zone, presumably because they were doing one of these other mitigation activities. But that tended to be the most clearly, a clear bit of information that people were told. Now, on all the stars that you see across, those are stars of items that are required in the home disclosures in the state of Louisiana by the state, by the seller to the buyer. So, you know, when you purchase a home, if you have purchased a home, you get all the disclosure requirements that are required by the federal government, the state government, and the local ones, as well as just realtor best practices. That's a big stack of paper that you're getting, but you're also in the state of Louisiana told about your flood zone, whether you've had any previous flooding, if you have a home flood elevation certificate, which means your home was elevated, if you had any kind of hail damage or wind damage from a hurricane, if your sellers had flood insurance, which means that you would also have to have flood insurance, and if there were any repairs due to hazard damage. So these were common things that were told, that should have been told to realtors according to the law in Virginia. And we're seeing that not all of them were necessarily communicated or at least understood by the buyer. So Louisiana, as you see in this map, is one of these states. Louisiana was the original gold standard of giving information out about risk from flooding in particular. Texas, Oklahoma, and Mississippi had followed suit and have very strict requirements from the seller to the buyer about what the status is of your property with regard to past flood damages and future flood exposures. Virginia, as you'll see, has none. And this is according to the latest NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council State Flood Risk Disclosure Scorecard. So once you have an idea about what your risks are, having that information really, we've noted, creates a cultural change. And that's a cultural change that I think the Hampton Roads Community Foundation and ICAR are most interested in perpetuating through this discussion. How do we change culture? Not just to be focused on the events, on the crisis, but to be prepared and to be mitigating about the future risks. So I'd certainly encourage you to explore what's available at your state. These are the latest evacuation routes that your state provides. And as well as to explore all of the other available resources from the emergency management offices in Virginia, as well as in your individual cities. Because the water is coming up and it will continue to come up, and we want you to be in the right place and the right space of mind. With that, I will invite Drs. Whitehead and Dr. Baer to join me for a discussion and for a great Q&A.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for that wonderful presentation. And thank you as well to the Hampton Roads Community Foundation and all of our sponsors tonight. I'd also like to thank Joan P. Brock for her generous support of the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience, or ICAR, and the Hampton Roads Community Foundation for supporting alive work like Recover Hampton Roads. I'm Dr. Jess Whitehead, and tonight I'm delighted to be home in the Commonwealth of Virginia on the campus of Old Dominion University. Finally, that's right, I'm a Virginia native. And for the first time in 40 years, I'm back in Virginia. I spent my youth and my professional career in South Carolina and North Carolina. And along the way, I've learned a thing or two about hurricanes in that time, especially as North Carolina's first statewide chief resilience officer. I'm so excited to be able to join ODU and to help ICAR take a lead role in not just research and innovation in climate resilience and adaptation, but in becoming a real solutions broker in the region and in training a new generation of a resilient workforce. I've been getting to know the region from afar the last couple of months, and I keep hearing people tell me, Jess, we don't get hurricanes here. You don't have to worry about that anymore. But Virginia has, from the storms of the 1600s that widened the Lynnhaven River and the storms of the 17 and 1800s that created Willoughby Spit to the modern impacts of Hurricane Isabel in 2003 that Dr. Martin mentioned. And Virginia will get hurricanes again. It's the exact same thing that everyone said in Georgia until 2017, when they broke their almost 100-year hurricane drought with damaging storms 3 years in a row. And as they found out, the impacts of a storm can fall well outside of the boundaries of the forecast cones. So if you take 3 words away from tonight's conversation, I want them to be prepare, respond, and recover. And we'll talk about these in the context of equity, the practical steps that you need to know for preparing today, and then some of the new and innovative systems that ODU is designing so that after the storm, recovery will be as smooth as possible. We got so many wonderful registration questions submitted by all of you, and we're going to address as many of those as possible. So without further ado, Dr. Martin, Dr. Baer, let's get started. So I'm coming here from North Carolina, and in 2018, we had 36 inches of rain in a single storm, Hurricane Florence. That was the end piece there of 3 so-called 500-year floods in a 20-year period for the state of North Carolina, Floyd, Matthew, and Florence. Yet I keep hearing as I'm getting settled in that, oh, hurricanes don't hit Virginia. So let's talk about the science of that. What's the worst that could happen in Hampton Roads?
Well, I'll jump in real quickly here. Emergency planners generally plan around a historic storm. So we got the 1933 Chesapeake Potomac storm, and that was fairly devastating. But for some people, they like to think out of the box and think about what's the worst case scenario? What's a black swan event? And we do a lot of modeling at the university, and we can create some of these very severe catastrophic events on Hampton Roads. It doesn't take very much effort to do that. So we ought to think outside the box a little bit and prepare for or think about the impact of storms that are beyond some of the historic storms. You know, we've had some close misses here at Hampton Roads, And sometimes we get complacent with 2 or 3 close misses in a row. We let our guard down a little bit. So I would caution the region not to let down your guard and think outside the box beyond what historically has happened here, and listen to some of the emergency managers and some of the modelers that are demonstrating some of the potential impact that could happen. It's very real.
I think that's exactly right. It is very real, Dr. Bear. And I feel like the lessons that happen after a major hazard event like Hurricane Isabel, which hit Virginia, and just in Virginia, over 103,000 properties were affected. So these do happen in Virginia. But look at all the environmental risks that you're exposed to. So a hurricane is one, and I know the broader session is referred to as a hurricane, but this is storms that aren't major hurricanes are going to affect Virginia. You cannot tell me. I know I'm in California right now. The joke is always it never rains in Southern California, but it rains in Virginia, and it, as you know, and so even extreme rains will be causing flooding in major parts of the Hampton Roads area, at least, due to stormwater infrastructure, limited capacity, as well as the gradual effects of sea level rise that are occurring from climate change. So think about, and like I said, so 168,000 properties have been flooded in Virginia. And by 2050, it's projected that almost 600,000 properties. So over 500,000 properties. So it's real.
And Dr. Martin, when we're looking at these numbers, I'm assuming that we're just looking at coastal impacts. So many people don't think about the inland impacts of a hurricane. Coming up to the Commonwealth, everything is very, very focused on coastal resilience. But if you go back into hurricane history and you think about Camille or Agnes and these tremendous inland rainfalls, there are flood walls along the James River in Richmond for a reason. So, do we have bigger estimates for, that inland flooding component, or is that something that the Commonwealth really needs to remember is a threat?
That's exactly right. So, but that big number included both riverine flooding as well as other inland waterway flooding that occurs. So yes, that's exactly right, Dr. Whitehead. There are lakes, there are rivers, there are creeks. People know who live next to the creek have seen the water rise during storms. I mean, this is a natural phenomenon, right? The more rain comes down, the more those specific bodies of water get filled. As the water coming down increases, the water rising up in the rivers does too. And so there have been major events on rivers in just the past few years. We've seen them in Iowa. We've seen them in places that you would not remotely identify as coastal, nor could anybody, I think, when looking at a map. But these places have massive riverine flooding.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention Iowa. When I first began the position as Chief Resilience Officer, one of my first trips to go and see a place 10 years after they had had a major event was Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And people just don't think about this as being an inland flood problem. I think we'd be remiss again without coming back to the point about climate change. And, what do we know about the science here in climate change? What are we looking at for the region here? Certainly, storms that could be, not necessarily more frequent, but potentially more severe or more intense. Are there northward shifts in the tracks? What are we talking about?
If you look at the National Climate Assessment, which I encourage everybody to do, and it's a very accessible document that we can read, that anybody can read, just look up National Climate Assessment. It's done by all of the federal agencies. The last version of it came out in the past administration. It's public information for everybody. And it's broken out by region, so you may not get individuals like your neighborhood level kinds of climate change effects. But it's important to realize that there's a wide range. You're looking at least 15 different climate effects. People tend to think only about hurricanes and sea level rise, right, if they're at the coast. But there's also heat, which is why I wanted to show that other slide at the beginning, that places like Virginia are experiencing higher heat. In the project that I have in New Orleans, just by 2030, which isn't far off, will have over 100 days a year that are over 100 degrees.
Wow.
So a third of the year is going to be unbearably hot. And if anybody has spent a day in the summer in New Orleans knows that that means that people with respiratory illnesses are going to be immediately at risk. That also means then that people are going to be turning to air conditioners, to all sorts of other fuel intensive technologies, and the cycle keeps going. So the effects are going to be numerous. Other parts of the country, the effects are going to be changing growing seasons, changing kinds of crops. That's certainly important for Virginia and the kinds of crops that are grown there. Workers who are building homes or who are outside for any length of period are going to be suffering from these effects. So more water in places like Virginia, it's more water and higher temperatures.
I'd like to also add very quickly that we're seeing evidence in terms of recurrent flooding, the nuisance day flooding, as people call it. And if you've been here for just last couple of decades, even anecdotally, you will understand that we're seeing more frequent and longer term standing water on some of our streets and in some of our areas. And I call that the slow cook effect, that some neighborhoods take repeated losses to their vehicles and to their contents of the home, disruption in getting to work or school or medical appointments because of this recurrent flooding. And those burdens fall heavily upon particular neighborhoods and particular demographic groups here in Hampton Roads. And if you accumulate the impact of those recurrent flooding events over the course of several decades, the cumulative impact in dollar terms can sometimes exceed that of a single major catastrophic event. So we pay a lot of attention to the big hurricane, the big catastrophic event approaching the coast. But today we're really living under an extended impact of that sea level rise, where the dollar value and the impact on households can accumulate something akin to a major single catastrophic event here in Hampton Roads, at least for those neighborhoods. So it's very real.
Oh, it's so real. I mean, so we're having a King Tide event here in Hampton Roads this week. It's not one of the bigger ones, but I've just moved into this house, and I've had to go through this process of needing to buy a home on a timeline, but needing something that, moving my mother in, and it needs to have a first floor bedroom and bathroom and laundry and everything. And so one of the things that I'm doing in the middle of this King Tide is I'm going out in the neighborhood in the middle of the night with a flashlight to be sure I can still get in. So let's bring it back to real people. We've already had one system named, Anna get named in 2021 before June 1st. I'm in big trouble. My wedding anniversary is on June 1st, so I could always remember what it was. 19 years later, by the time I have my 20th anniversary, June 1st may no longer be the first day of hurricane season again. So what should people in Hampton Roads region be doing today to be ready for what NOAA's predicting to be yet another above average hurricane season?
Well, goodness, from the household level, you can anticipate the storm. You should know your zone. If you don't know, you can go onto your city website or go to Virginia Department of Emergency Management and visually look at a map and just figure out where you live. Know your zone. The governor may issue an evacuation order. Those zones are generally associated with those areas that are greatest at risk, that are proximate, the river line or the water line. So knowing that zone, if you're a low to moderate income household and you can't afford evacuation, large expenses associated with that, know your shelter system. There are state and local sheltering system. Get in contact with your city and know your shelter ahead of time. Prepare your medications, prepare a communication tree with your extended family, those type of things. Those are very practical things you can do in preparation of the hurricane season, which is soon upon us.
So here's another thing you just mentioned, Dr. Baer, sheltering. We're coming out of, at least for the moment, what seems to, maybe it's over, maybe it's just a lull in the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously this was a huge concern last year with vaccines coming in, maybe not as much this year, but there's variants out there. What about sheltering and COVID-19?
Well, I would say that it's flying a bit below the radar, but the state has been working tirelessly at the state and local level to prepare for hurricane season under a pandemic type of environment. So it certainly hasn't gone unnoticed. It may not have been as well publicized, but there's been a huge shift in preparing the capacity of shelters, the training of staff, the training of volunteers. How do you screen people? How do you manage people that have infection? Those type of things. So there's been a huge change in the culture, to borrow Carlos's language from his presentation. There's been a really large shift that's been occurring in the last 12 months in thinking about the compound threat of a hurricane in the pandemic environment. So just know that the state and the localities have been working tirelessly to make that shift.
So these are all things to do, when a hurricane is approaching, have your kit, know your zone, know where to go. What about other things that you can do to prepare, your insurance? Is flood insurance covered under homeowners insurance?
So that's an important thing always to ask. It is not covered under in the United States. Flood insurance is not covered under the standard property owner's insurance. So people need to understand this. So if you don't have it, it's either because you're not required to, or you haven't voluntarily sought it out. Knowing that the flood maps are changing and changing this year and changing repeatedly, I would certainly suggest that you look at voluntary national flood insurance. So the National Flood Insurance Program is what covers flood risks to your homes. And that exists because in many places, the local private insurers weren't able to do this. So it's a big concern. It's really important, in addition to all of the things that Dr. Burr has mentioned in terms of preparedness, that you also think about how are you protecting your family. When we think about your priorities, you mentioned three things that you come up with, Dr. Whitehead. I would say it's family, community, and possessions, right? So is my family going to be okay? What's the plan for the evacuation? What can I do to make sure we're going to be all right in terms of food, water, etc.? Look at your community. Look at where the evacuation shelters are. Look at what things are being planned so that you don't have to evacuate, right? What kind of infrastructure is being built in your area? And finally, look at things like your insurance. If you're a renter, you might definitely want to look into renter's insurance. It's the least taken up of all insurance programs. Most renters don't realize that they should get it or is useful. But unfortunately, in most places, renters, even in New Orleans, are not told about any kind of flood risks to their apartment. So just for your possessions, you want to be sure that you have that covered. But definitely look into whether your current policies include national flood insurance program policies, because in some places they just get rolled up into a package.
And I'm so glad, Dr. Martine, that you mentioned that about renters. That's something that we heard so often in North Carolina, that people assumed that because they were a renter, there wasn't an NFIP flood policy that they could get, and they can. And the other big myth that we heard was, if I'm not in a flood zone, I can't get flood insurance, and you absolutely can. I just did. So, Dr. Bear?
We've done surveys where we interview households across Hampton Roads, and we know that here in Hampton Roads, and I don't think it's unusual, but many households do not understand that the current policies do not cover the damages incurred from some of the storms. And so there's an awareness issue in Hampton Roads. A lot of households simply aren't aware of the NFIP, and other households simply don't have access because of resources. So like many other things in our society today, it takes money to purchase it. It takes awareness, but it takes willingness, and it takes some money to purchase insurance. We know that across Hampton Roads, vulnerable communities, low to moderate income communities tend to have very, very low NFIP participation.
That is such a critical point, Dr. Bear, this idea of equity as it comes to
Mhm.
vulnerability. And so vulnerability isn't the same as exposure. Like we have this myth that a hurricane will hit a wealthy person the same way it'll hurt a low income person. And that's simply not true, because a wealthy person will have a house that is built in a certain way to be stronger, will have the insurance policies in place, will have a variety of other recovery mechanisms entitled to her, whereas the low income person may not have them for her and her family. So certainly we need to think about where your house is. I mean, a lot of this is based on historical issues with how housing is built in this country, and that certain people, particularly African Americans and Native Americans, weren't allowed to live in certain places. So this is an ongoing issue that I think is just being surfaced, and that we're starting to realize plays an effect. Because, like I said, cash is king, right? Cash is the command. And in the United States, the cash that is given out is based on the value of your property, which means that wealthier people will be entitled to more recovery and relief, and in many cases, mitigation. Wealthier communities, that like a city government or a neighborhood, are more likely to be able to hire consultants to write an application for a voluntary mitigation program that is a stellar application and wins. But the poor city or the poor county just doesn't have that kind of resources, so they can't even step up. They can't even enter the game. So there are so many ways in which that equity plays out, this inequity plays out.
And Carlos, you showed a couple maps of some of the losses in terms of home damage, and you cited some figures. But we know from interviewing households across the region also that a substantial amount of loss isn't recorded. So the idea of repetitive loss, you're talking about people that participate in the flood insurance program and they suffer a loss. That's documented, recorded, and we can map that and show those areas that have repetitive loss. But I proffer at the university here that there is a sizable chunk of loss that takes place repeatedly and repetitively that isn't captured in these data at all. And vulnerable households, for example, if they take a loss to the vehicle or repair a vehicle, even though it's it's a $2,500 vehicle, it's much harder for that household to absorb the cost of that repair or loss relative to a higher or middle income household. So if you just look at in raw dollars and you look at vulnerability in terms of a cost of structures or raw dollars, it really misses or misaligns our concept of vulnerability for the low moderate income household here in Hampton Roads.
Yeah, I'm so glad that the point of equity has come up, both from the point of the individual and from the community level. And you're exactly right. And I'm going to come back to communities in a minute. But thinking about individuals, we've talked about racial equity, ethnic equity. Medically fragile populations are also, especially often are also low income. But it's such a big challenge to think about if you have some kind of impairment or differing ability, how do you evacuate? What can you do in your neighborhood after a storm? Dr. Bear, can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. We know, and we've published on this, and I welcome anybody to take a look at some of the publications that are produced at the university. But we know that medically fragile populations have a lower propensity to evacuate relative non-medically fragile populations. Well, medically fragile populations, if you had to choose one group that you would want to get out of harm's way with an impending storm, it would be the medically fragile population. Medically fragile populations have a very difficult time preparing for weathering and recovering from a storm event. Some very slight changes in the environment, fallen debris can be a trip hazard for sight impaired or mobility challenged folks. So those medically fragile populations are the populations that ought to be moved out of harm's way. Unfortunately, those populations have a lower propensity to evacuate relative to other populations. What accounts for that difference in propensity to evacuate? It has a fair amount to do with income, risk perception, and being comfortable in being out of your traditional environment in a new, unfamiliar environment where there may not be support for your medical regimen. There's a lot of comorbidity among populations here in Hampton Roads. And if you're older, a population that has a medical condition, just the logistics of getting on a congested road, getting to a destination point where you're not certain they'll have a hotel or sheltering for you, it's actually overwhelming. It's a lot of anxiety. And for those reasons, those populations shelter in place, maybe approximate to a shoreline where there is high risk. So what we need to do is we need to reassure, it's a communication, an education thing. We need to reassure populations that are medically fragile, that there are medically friendly shelters, and that medical regimen can have continuity outside their traditional neighborhood or the traditional home out there. So it's a combination. We need to have the capacity to provide for those populations, but we also need to communicate that and raise awareness in those medically fragile populations.
Yeah, great point. So coming back then to the community challenges in equity and in recovery. So, Hurricane Hugo was my storm as a child. I didn't live through the storm, but I did live through my mother having to recover our home from a distance. Dr. Baer, similarly, you have family members who lived through Katrina, and then you had to come and you had to experience the recovery. Dr. Martine, I know you've lived through earthquakes and wildfires and all of those, both for yourself and your family. So what is it like to really live through a recovery? There's so much focus on response. We don't talk nearly enough about recovery, and that's the part that lasts for years. Does FEMA just swoop in and fix it all? How long does it really take?
It's far from the picture of the cavalry coming in and saving you. The reality is, particularly if it's a significant disaster, that just on the physical side, the property is being rebuilt, et cetera. Other studies that we've done looking at housing recovery, that in some cases homes never get rebuilt, and in other cases that both by choice and by unfortunate force. In other cases, it takes up to 4 years for homes to be rebuilt. The dream, of course, is that everything gets rebuilt quickly. The challenge for local governments as well as state and national governments is if you want it done quickly, you may also not get it done well. And you may not get it done well in terms of the equity, like who gets what kinds of resources, and are you targeting the right people? So the federal government has gotten a little better about this over time by being very clear about low and moderate income households getting access to the long-term recovery. But this is a very long process. And in other studies that I mentioned before I pass it over to Dr. Baer to hear his responses, the financial effects from disaster disproportionately, we know that, disproportionately harm low-income people. But those effects, we noted, went up to 4 years, heavily in 4 years. It went on a downward slope. For example, people with a low credit score prior to the event happening, through like a medium-sized disaster, not even the major disasters or a small-scale one, through a medium-sized disaster. In the first year, their credit scores went down by 13 points. By the fourth year, they were down by 30 points. And we know this from our financial studies of what happens to people who are hit by any kind of financial shock. So physical shock, like an environmental shock, a hurricane, a flood, are economic shocks to families. So, and the only reason we only know that it went up to 4 years is because our data only went to 4 years. Clearly, the likelihood is that that downward slope continues well past and people go into a downward spiral.
Yes. I'd say recovery is a long haul, and the trauma is absolutely huge in a catastrophic event. Familiar environments are dashed or shattered. There's acute injuries in your immediate family and deaths. And people don't, if you haven't lived through a catastrophic event, people generally don't seem to appreciate the trauma that's felt at the household level and at the community level. Everything that's familiar with you that seems permanent and fixed is altered. And how can my environment be changed to this degree? And so the trauma that is experienced at the individual level, at the household level, and at the community level is very, very real. And that impacts the ability of households to get back up and running. So it isn't so as easy under a recovery environment to coordinate the finances, to hire the contractors, to negotiate the permitting process with the city and bureaucracy when a family member has died or your neighbor has died and everything you know is disrupted. It's trauma, and trauma plays a huge role in the pace of that recovery.
Absolutely. And, one thing that we certainly saw in North Carolina after Matthew, and then especially after Florence, where we're looking at, so FEMA doesn't come in and fix it all. The federal system, even the state system, is not designed to make everyone whole again. Everyone has to play a part. It was the role of volunteerism and volunteer groups. I think a lot of people think that that's some failure of the federal system, when the reality is that it's by design. People come in and help. And there are groups that stay in communities rebuilding homes even well into the recovery for years and years and years and years. There's a permanent presence of a lot of these groups in the state of North Carolina. So Dr. Baer, can you specifically talk about what ODU is doing to launch Recover Hampton Roads and how it's going to help coordinate those volunteer duties that are a part of hurricane recovery?
Terrific. For time, I'll keep it fairly brief here, but if there are people with further interest, you can follow up. But the university has identified as a strategic initiative of the university the idea of the Recover Hampton Roads organization. Recover Hampton Roads is a partnership among the university, the Hampton Roads Community Foundation, and the initial cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth. And Recover Hampton Roads is preparing under blue skies, today under blue skies, to anticipate a storm, preparing for the focus of Recover Hampton Roads is on medically fragile and vulnerable populations, LMI populations, low to moderate income households that tend to suffer very long, as Carlos mentioned, displacement times, sometimes 2, 3, 4 years and beyond before they return to normal housing. So the university has recognized this, the Hampton Roads Community Foundation recognized this as an equity and justice issue. And we know from our modeling in the region, we know from past storms in other areas, we know how a catastrophic event is going to play out here in Hampton Roads. And it isn't going to be pretty. And there's disparate impacts among our communities here. And if we know this ahead of time, it's part of our, we're called to be better prepared and prepare for recovery. And Recover Hampton Roads is that organization that's going to try and coordinate the convergence of volunteer labor and donated material that tend to flow into a region following a storm, and target those resources, the volunteer labor and donated material, to displaced vulnerable households. Have those households identified early on under blue skies, prepare for the storm, and try and target some of that energy and resources to get those households back into stable housing sooner rather than later. And that's the focus of Recover Hampton Roads in a nutshell. Thanks for.
Yeah, and I should probably clarify, it's something that's just launching. If we have a big event this year, there's not a big staff ready to go there. But one of the things that I was so excited about, having seen this in North Carolina post Florence, is the opportunity to use technology to do some of this coordination. We found during Florence that it was, word of mouth and meetings and who could make phone calls to try to coordinate. And there would be places where we had a whole lot of volunteer effort and places where people just hadn't gotten there yet and nobody knew that no one had gotten there yet. So can you talk a little bit about the technology component that will eventually be operational with Recover Hampton Roads?
Sure. So, well, we know ahead of time those neighborhoods that are vulnerable in a sense. This is another, get back to Carlos, what he mentioned. How do we conceive of vulnerability? We know ahead of time which neighborhoods, we can anticipate which neighborhoods are likely to have households when they're displaced have very, very long displacement times. So if we know that ahead of time, we want to prepare it for the recoveries in those neighborhoods, especially. The university and the community foundation and other donors have invested in the development of a platform. It's called Convergence Inventory Matching and Assignment, CIMA, C-I-M-A platform. It's a tool, decision support tool that's being developed for Recover Hampton Roads in partnership with HUD. And it's a generalizable tool that can be used in other urban coastal areas that may experience a severe weather event. So the university is setting up the organization and the model of the partnership with Recover Hampton Roads between the university and the community foundation There's another thing that's exportable from the region. But the third thing exportable from the region will be this decision support tool that's being developed here at the university to be used for other recovery organizations in other coastal areas.
Excellent. So it sounds to me like the best solution in an ideal world would be to not be at risk, but we all know there's way too much existing and to love about Hampton Roads to completely eliminate that risk and say that that's the solution. So what can we do to minimize risk for the long term, both as residents and as a region? I know one thing specifically that Dr. Rice had wanted me to mention was fortified roofs. For those of you who aren't familiar with this program, because it doesn't really have a big footprint in the Commonwealth, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety does rigorous testing in a wind tunnel in a facility that they've specially built for the purpose of structures to figure out how to make it more hurricane resistant, more flood resistant, more wildfire resistant. And the Fortified Standards is a program that's been used throughout the Gulf Coast and much of the Southeast, where they've tested in the wind tunnels different ways to seal the decking on roofs and to mount vents and to sheath the gables. Other states have a lot of incentives for getting homeowners to install these fortified roofs. You go through a program, you get bronze, silver, or gold level certified on the roof. The Commonwealth doesn't have that, but certainly looking into and asking and encouraging roofing contractors here to become trained and certified in fortified roofing would be the benefit of not having to pay out your claim. That percentage on your deductible is a big hit, right? So what are some of the other kinds of long-term ways we can minimize risk?
So I would like to just refer back to some of the mitigation activities that we saw and that were occurring post-Katrina in New Orleans. That could be helpful. Things like making sure that if you should elevate your house, you could. This is for individual households, right? Making sure that you have the right insurance, asking the right questions and pushing on that, checking to find out what is your actual risk. Go to these websites, go to ICAR, find out what as much as you can. There's a lot of information sources out there, but if you trust people, go to credible organizations that are scientifically bound at universities like Old Dominion and in organizations like FEMA and NOAA. You can find a lot of resources. FEMA actually has easy to use brochures about things you could do with your house for a hurricane, for a flood, for wind damage, for a variety of different pieces. So things you can upgrade on. The challenge you're going to have as a homeowner is what contractor should I get and who has this kind of certification. So you should look for homeowners with some kind of experience in doing these repairs. Certainly most roof repairers in the Hamptons Road region, I would hope, have some kind of experience with this, but these are good opportunities for you to start exploring those. The other thing I want to just quickly point out, since we're talking about community, is that some of what you can do isn't just physical, isn't just to your property and your possessions and insuring them and protecting them, but also getting involved in your community. I think one of the things that Dr. Bear pointed out that happens after disaster psychologically is that people want to return to normal as quick as possible. That's why people want to rebuild exactly the way things were, even if it wasn't so great before the storm hit, right? And then their community wasn't exactly the way they wanted it. They just want to return to some sense of normal. And I think one of the positives, we've been talking about a lot of things that may depress people who are listening, is to think about how that new normal, the positive aspects of that new normal, including being civically engaged, going, listening to what your city is planning. If they're planning a big seawall, and arguing that instead of that seawall, why don't we do a wetlands restoration? Because it'll provide more recreation for my community. It'll give me an opportunity to fish. It'll give me an opportunity to protect our homes without all the costs of doing another seawall that's going to fail in 10 years, et cetera. So I think, and civic engagement isn't just talking about those projects, but also figuring out what kind of networks we can create, neighborhood phone networks in the event of a storm. Can I check on the elderly neighbors, those that are physically challenged on my block? Like, these are all important social programs that we always forget. And that should be our new normal.
Oh, I'm so glad and you mentioned phone too, because remember, not everybody uses the internet. We would have do events with NCORE and be getting public comment in for our CDBG and ask people for email contacts coming into these public meetings, and people wouldn't have one because they're older or they live in a neighborhood that just doesn't have really good internet access. So checking on your neighbors by knocking on the door, picking up the phone is so important and so impactful. This has been so great. We haven't even gotten to big things like, the resilience work that the city of Norfolk's doing. But I do want to do one really quick rapid fire question to close. For both of you, thinking forward for the Hampton Roads region, both as individuals or collectively as a community, what are your top 2 priorities that you would say coming out of this that people need to do to be more ready for hurricanes? Dr. Baer, let's start with the Virginia perspective.
Okay, off the top of my head, I'd say we need to prioritize our preparation for recovery. You've heard me beat that drum in the last 30, 45 minutes. We need to prioritize our preparation for recovery. We need to do several things to do that. And first and foremost, I would say we need to recognize that current disparities that we have in our health and well-being that exist today under blue skies, the current disparities that we have will be exacerbated and magnified by the shock of a severe weather event like a hurricane. And some of the progress we've made in narrowing the gap in health and well-being in Hampton Roads in Virginia, we've made great strides over the last couple of decades, a tremendous way to go. But some of those gains that we've made, just recognize that in an event of a severe weather event, a shock to the system, some of those disparities will be exacerbated again, and it will take decades to again make up for lost time. So those disparities will persist multi-generationally, and they continue on. And so what we ought to do, those are equity and justice issues. And if we know this, that shock to the system will exacerbate existing disparities in health and well-being and educational attainment and a whole range of different things, we ought to be able to prepare for that and try to prepare for recovery. You're not going to eliminate the growth and disparity that's going to happen under a severe weather event, but we certainly can lessen the impact that it may have. That's the first thing. And the second thing I would say is we need to understand that displaced populations suffer enormously in a recovery environment. In the wake of a severe weather event, those populations that are displaced have increased pain, decreased longevity, increased anxiety. Populations experience trauma. There's disruptions to educational attainment. There's disruptions to employment and income, increases in substance abuse. I mean, you go down the list. There's a long list of horrible things that happen to populations that are displaced, households that are displaced, not just a couple months, but 12, 18, 24, 36 months before they come back to stable housing. So these
Absolutely
disparities really hit vulnerable, medically fragile populations really hard. It isn't unusual for a low to moderate income, medically fragile household to be displaced 4 years plus. So I would say what we need to do is recognize this first. That's the first step. Recognize that the disparities exist and they'll be exacerbated. And that's the first step to being proactive and taking action ahead of time. And that kind of recognizing that is what Recover Hampton is about, and preparing for that recovery focused on those populations.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Baer. Dr. Martine, how about a more national perspective to close us out, please?
Sure. All national perspective for individual households. I'll leave you with 2 words: knowledge and power. So Dr. Baer gave excellent recommendations for revisiting the institutions and the structures that affect emergency management. I'd say if you're an individual, you want to get as much information as possible about your house, your family, and its exposure, and what you need to do and what you can do. And then power. Hold your elected officials accountable. Go to those civic town halls where they're proposing a new seawall or proposing to do some major redevelopment that is going to have storm effects. for you. Knowledge and power.
Oh, I can't think of a better way to close this out. Thank you so much. I have enjoyed this conversation tremendously. I hope that you all at home have too, whether you're watching through the registration link or on Facebook Live or on YouTube. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our sponsors. And I'd like to turn the program back over to Dr. Rice.
Oh, thank you. That was wonderful. There's so much to think about. And I thank you, Dr. Martine, Dr. Whitehead, Dr. Baer, for sharing your expertise and so ably helping us to prepare for this hurricane season. After tonight's program, you will be able to find resources on the Hampton Roads Community Foundation website that was sent to us by our speakers. You'll find a recording of this event. You'll find Dr. Martine's slide presentation and the full bios for our speakers. We hope that these resources will be helpful to you as you prepare for this hurricane season that starts very soon, or maybe it's already started. Thank you for joining us for this evening and have a wonderful evening. Good night.